You think you're saving money, but every cheap decision you make is quietly draining your bank account and your time and your sanity far more than you realize. Because the truth is, cheap rarely stays cheap. It just hides the real costs until it's just too late. And once you start seeing how this plays out across your life, it becomes impossible to unsee because cheap products and break and cheap services they cut corners and cheap decisions they compound and cheap thinking keeps people stuck in cycles where they're constantly replacing, repairing, and regretting, and repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And the reason this happens is simple. When you choose based only on the lowest price, you're ignoring the durability, efficiency, and the reliability and long term value. And those are the exact things that determine whether something actually saves you money or quietly becomes a financial leak. It takes something as simple as buying a cheap pair of shoes. They look fine at first, okay? They cost half as much as a quality pair, and it feels like a win. But within a few months, the soles wear down and the stitching starts to fail, and now you're back in the store buying another pair, and then another, and before you know it, you're spending more than you would have on a single high quality pair that could have lasted years. But it's not just about money. It's about time and mental energy too. Every time something cheap fails, you're forced to deal with it. Whether that's making a return, waiting for a replacement, or fixing something that shouldn't have broken, or just dealing with the frustration of something not working the way it should. And those hidden costs add up faster than people realize because time is the one thing you just can't get back. And cheap choices are often time traps disguised as savings. And now, scale that up to bigger purchases like appliances, tools, or electronics, and the impact becomes even more obvious. A cheap refrigerator that breaks down or runs inefficiently can cost you hundreds more in electricity and repairs. A cheaper tool that fails mid project can cost you hours of work and potentially even safety risks. A cheaper laptop that slows you down every single day doesn't just cost you productivity, it costs you opportunities. And this is where the real shift in thinking needs to happen because the smartest buyers aren't asking what the cheapest options are. They're asking what gives me the best value over time. And value is completely different in equation. It includes lifespan, performance, maintenance costs, and well, something actually does what it's supposed to do. And once you start thinking in terms of value instead of price, you begin to see why cheap can be so expensive. But it goes even deeper than physical products because this principle applies to decisions too, your habits, and even your mindset. For example, people often choose the cheapest path in learning, skipping fundamentals and avoiding the effort, and looking for the shortcuts and expecting fast results. But those shortcuts almost always lead to gaps in knowledge, and that comes back later and costs more time to fix. So, or worse, they prevent real progress altogether. And the same thing happens in the business. Cutting corners to save money up front might increase short term profits, but it can damage your reputation, reduce the quality, and drive away customers, which ends up costing far more in the long run. And then there's the idea of opportunity costs, which is one of the most overlooked aspects of cheap decisions. When you choose something based purely on the price, you're not just spending the money, you're also choosing what you're giving up. A cheap product that performs poorly might prevent you from doing something faster or better. A cheap service might limit your results. A cheap decision might keep you stuck when a slightly more expensive option could have opened up doors. And that hidden cost people rarely calculate because it's not always visible, but it's always there. And this is why people who consistently invest in quality tend to move ahead faster because they're not constantly dealing with breakdowns, replacements, and limitations. They're building on a solid foundations instead of patching together weak ones. And it's important to understand that this doesn't mean you should always buy the most expensive option because expensive doesn't automatically mean better. There's a difference between expensive and valuable, and the goal isn't to spend more money, it's to spend smarter, which means identifying where quality actually matters and where it doesn't. Because there are areas where going cheap is fine, things that don't impact performance, safety, or long term use. But the key is being intentional instead of reactive because most people don't consciously decide to buy cheap, they default to it. They see a lower price and assume it's the better deal without thinking about the bigger picture. And that's where the cycle begins. Because once you start making decisions based on short term savings instead of long term value, you create patterns that repeat across your life. And those patterns are what separate people who are constantly struggling from who are consistently building. And one of the most powerful shifts you can make is asking a different question before you buy or decide anything. Instead of asking how much does this cost, ask what will this cost me over time. And that simple change forces you to consider durability, reliability, efficiency, and overall impact. And it immediately filters out options that only look good on the surface. And because the cheapest option isn't often cheap for a reason, it is often. Maybe it uses lower quality materials, maybe it skips important features, maybe it's designed to fail sooner. And while that might not matter in the moment, it absolutely matters every time. And companies know this. Many business models aren't built around selling cheap products that need to be replaced frequently because repeat purchases generate more profit than long lasting products. And once you understand that, you start to see why cheap options are so heavily marketed and they appeal to the desire for immediate savings while quietly ignoring the long term consequences. And this is where discipline comes in because choosing value over price, it often requires spending more upfront. And that can feel uncomfortable, especially if you're used to focusing on immediate costs, but that discomfort is usually temporary, while the benefits of a better decision last much longer. And over time, those better decisions they compound just like cheap ones do. Except, okay, instead of constant replacement and frustration, you get consistency, reliability, and fewer problems to deal with. And that creates a completely different experience. One where your tools work, your system holds up, and your progress isn't constantly interrupted. And another area where cheap becomes expensive is health. People often choose cheaper food options that are highly processed and low in nutritional value. And while that saves you money at the grocery store, it can lead to higher health costs and lower energy levels and reduce quality of life over time. And the same applies to fitness. Avoid investment in proper training equipment or guidance can lead to injuries or the lack of progress, which ends up costing more in the long run. And this highlighted an important point. The true cost of something isn't always financial, it can be physical too, mental, or even emotional. And those costs are often much higher than the price tag suggests. And once you start factoring those in, the idea of cheap changes completely because something that saves you a few dollars but creates stress or frustration or long term problems isn't actually cheap at all. It's expensive in ways that are harder to measure but impossible to ignore. And once they accumulate, and the same principle applies to relationships and decisions, choosing the easy or cheap option in communication or effort or commitment can lead to bigger problems later. Because anything built on minimal investment tends to have minimal stability. And fixing those problems later often requires more effort than doing it right the first time. And this is the core idea. Doing things right once is almost always cheaper than doing them wrong multiple times. But doing it right requires a shift in the mindset. It requires patience, awareness, and a willingness to look beyond immediate cost. And that's not how much people are conditioned to think, especially in a world where everything is marketed for speed, convenience, and how price is. But if you want to break out of the cycles that keep draining your resources, you have to start questioning those defaults. You have to recognize that cheap is often a shortcut that leads to a longer path. And once you understand that, you can start making decisions that actually move you forward instead of keeping you stuck in the loop or of replacements and regrets. And over time, that shift doesn't just save you money, it saves you time. It reduces the stress and creates a level of consistency that allows you to focus on bigger goals instead of constantly fixing small problems. And that's where the real value shows up, not in the initial purchase, but in everything that comes after it. Because when something works the way it should and lasts long as it should, it frees you up to think, create, and build without an interruption. And that's something cheap options rarely provide. So the next time you're faced with a decision and the cheaper option looks tempting, take a second to zoom out and ask yourself what you're really paying for. Because the number on the price tag is only part of the story. And if you ignore the rest, you might save money today, but you'll just certainly pay for it later in ways that cost far more than you expected. Thanks for watching today. If you found value in today's video, please subscribe. I'm looking to build this channel. Without a subscription base, I cannot do that. So I would love to see you on the team and subscribe. I would love to see you down in the comments as well. Anything positive, I've always tried to comment back on and give my comments back. And also check this video to the right. It can also help you on your journey as well. Take care, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.